Greetings and welcome to Bloomberg New Economy Conversations. I'm Andy Brown. Around the world, big tech has emerged from COVID-19 more dominant than ever. At one point last year, the biggest tech firms accounted for a quarter of the US stock market value. Now comes the backlash. In China, the Communist Party state is reasserting itself against the big tech platforms that threaten its monopoly on power. Jack Ma, the country's richest person, finds himself in the crosshairs of the regulators. Europe doesn't have its own tech giants, but it's taking on the oligopolies of Silicon Valley, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and others in the name of protecting small businesses and the consumer. In the US, meanwhile, the nation is caught up in an impassioned debate about the role of social media giants. The polarizing effect of social media echo chambers, viral misinformation, rampant conspiracy theories have produced a full-blown political crisis. Millions believe Donald Trump's big lie that the US presidential election was stolen. The storming of the Capitol by mobs of his outraged supporters threatened democracy itself. Now arguments are raging over whether Twitter was right to deplatform the US president. Here to discuss all this and more is an all-star panel of experts. Duncan Clark is the chairman of investment advisory firm BDA China, which he founded in 1994. He's also the author of Alibaba, the house that Jack Ma built, which has been published in more than 30 languages. Welcome to the program, Duncan.
Thank you.
Richard Edelman is the CEO of global communications firm Edelman, which was named PR Agency of the Decade by both Advertising Age and the Holmes Report. Thank you for joining us, Richard.
Thank you for having me, Andy.
Karen Kornblue is the senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, leading its digital innovation and democracy initiative. She's also the chair of the Open Technology Fund, a government-funded nonprofit advancing global internet freedom. And she served as the US ambassador to the OECD in Paris during the Obama administration. Thanks for being here today, Karen.
Thanks for having me.
Catherine Ma is the CEO of the Wikimedia Foundation, the non-profit organization that operates Wikipedia and the Wikimedia projects. She has worked with UNICEF, the National Democratic Institute, the World Bank, Access Now on programs supporting technologies for domestic participation, civic engagement, and open government. Welcome to the program, Catherine.
Thanks, Andy.
I'm joining you today from New York, and I'd like to welcome our global community of Bloomberg New Economy delegates who've attended the forum for these past 3 years. We also welcome our viewers tuning in on social media and the Bloomberg terminal. There will be opportunities throughout this conversation for real-time input from you, our audience. I encourage you to submit questions in the text box in the bottom right of your screen, and I'll invite you to vote in live polling at the top right of your screen. If at any point you encounter technical difficulties, a simple refresh of your browser should help get things back on track. Now, let's start with an audience poll to see what our viewers think about the social media platform's decision to suspend Donald Trump's account earlier this month. Question, were Twitter and Facebook right to deplatform Donald Trump after the riot he incited at the Capitol on January 6th? Your options are yes, it headed off more violence. No, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey should not be the arbiters of free speech on the internet. It was the right move, but there should be better regulation from government guiding decisions like this. The internet should prioritize freedom with minimal censorship and regulation. While we wait for the audience to submit their answers to the poll, let's get to today's fire starter interview. Yesterday, I spoke to Mitchell Baker, the CEO and chairwoman of Mozilla Corporation, which operates the Firefox web browser. And I put the very same question to her that I just put to our audience. Take a listen. Mitchell Baker, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Mitchell, I'm going to ask you right off the bat, was it the right decision by Twitter and Facebook to deplatform Donald Trump?
The platforms have to do something different than they have been. We've had years of experience of the platforms doing nothing and allowing violence to continue. And so in the moment, the head of state is hard to imagine, but the platforms have to start acting differently. And even if we decide that deplatforming needs different rules or regulations, we have to see it in action and understand all sides of the issue. We have so much experience in the platforms doing nothing. So moving into the zone where we can actually see and understand and debate what it looks like when the platforms take action is an important step.
Okay, I'm not sure that I heard a yes or a no to that question.
Well, you heard an absolute yes that the platforms need to be doing something differently. And so this was a case where certainly it's hard to imagine standing by and doing nothing in this case.
You would agree, though, that social media played a big role in the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th.
Well, certainly all the research shows that organizing occurred on social media, and earlier than that a lot of the extremist, developing of extreme ideas thrives in these places. So yes.
You yourself, in a recent blog post, offered specific suggestions for changes in social media platforms, for instance, in how algorithms amplify content. My question is this: who enforces these new rules?
Well, that's clearly the question of the day. That's something that's going to take some experimentation. I expect in the long run, it will be some combination of the platforms and society, i.e. via government and regulation, in understanding what's actually happening. So our proposals were way before deplatforming. Deplatforming is a question of a moment. It's it's after many, many, many steps. And so well before that, I mean, even if we decide deplatforming makes sense, as a society, you want it to be at the end of a long process, not out of the blue. And so things like what's actually happening, general transparency, what are the algorithms, who's targeting them, who's paying for them? These things, if they were available, that kind of information to us, we would be able to understand and make better decisions about, as a society, how much regulation we want and what we're trying to build.
The Europeans tend to think that government should take the lead on regulation. What role do you think the state should play?
I think the state represents society and should be actively engaged. As an individual citizen right now, for example, what could I do? It's hard to leave Facebook. I mean, I can leave, but others are still tagging me, like all sorts of things are happening. As an individual, there's almost nothing I can do to affect the overall power of the system. That's why we have government. And so I confess that I wouldn't consider myself of the European view, because I think the sense that the government knows best and can regulate is maybe stronger in Europe, but I think the Europeans are actually absolutely right that citizens and society and government have to play a role in the critical infrastructure. That's true with every other industry as they've become important, that there's some role for society. And so I think it's good for the planet and good for all of us that the Europeans and their government are looking at these issues carefully, and I would say very thoughtfully. The current draft laws in the EU are really about platform accountability across the spectrum of activities. So there's a lot to learn there.
Mozilla's mission contained in a 2007 manifesto that you yourself personally drafted, is to help create an internet that is open and accessible to all. Is that ideal now, do you think, under threat in the United States?
So I think we're probably asking, does deplatforming, if it's ever employed, put that at threat? And I would say no. The issue is open and accessible to all means that each one of us should have access and the same ability. And it shouldn't be only, we'll say, the Western nations or only some race or some class or some gender, that each one of us should have the opportunities of the internet. It does not mean that bad behavior or criminal behavior or murder threats or death or rape threats or insurrection or violence should go unanswered. It means that each of us should have the same opportunities, and that society as a whole, when we address bad behavior, we should address it equally for all of us. There's people who suffer when there's no deplatforming. We talk about it with Donald Trump, but plenty of people have been cut off of their accounts that we don't know about. And so building the overall system where we're treated equally and we all have the opportunities of the internet and we are all accountable and responsible for our own behavior is a critical part. You can't build a society if people aren't responsible for their behavior.
Mozilla is a non-profit. Firefox, your web browser, is open source. It relies on armies of volunteers all over the world, improving the product, localizing some of the software. How should social media industry balance the need for commercial profit and public good? Clearly, the two are now in conflict.
Yes. So there's a set of things I think we can learn from other industries. Technology is not the only industry, or social media, where you've got both benefits and externalities or significant drawbacks or costs. So I think it's hard to ask the companies to do that alone themselves. Really, the way the corporate system is set up, it's really profit driven. And so I think there will be some changes that come from the companies, some from the employees, some as the leaders learn more. But I think a lot is going to have to be in concert with either consumer demand for something better and or consumer voice through government, i.e. regulation. I don't know of an industry that we expect to regulate itself. We don't expect, the energy industries to, all regulate themselves, food, tobacco, most industries, that balance between the benefits and what's too much cost for society is involved in. So I do think we'll see some change from technologists over time. The current companies, hard to say, but in connection with changing consumer demand, which needs competition and regulation. We'll need all of those.
Are you seeing at Mozilla a consumer backlash to social media and big tech more broadly? For instance, you've got a Firefox add-on that blocks Facebook, as you just described it, from tracking your progress around the internet. Is that popular? Are you seeing more take up on that product, or does the consumer not really care?
Yes. So right now, what we see is more people care. It's still hard to know what to do, and it's hard to get past the sense of helplessness. So the add-on that you described is called Facebook Container. And what it does, obviously when you're at the Facebook site, or if you're adding information, Facebook is gathering that because you're giving it to them. But beyond that, when you travel around the web, Facebook travels with you and they gather information on things you do on sites totally unrelated to Facebook. And so what the Facebook Container does is it stops the latter. And that is a very popular add-on. But there's so much in technology, and I think it's a lot to ask consumers to protect ourselves. So we hope people use it. We encourage it to use these kinds of tools, but we think those are just the examples of how the world could be different.
Mitchell Baker, thank you for your time. Thanks for your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Our thanks to Mozilla CEO Mitchell Baker for taking the time to join us. I was struck by the phrase she used, a sense of helplessness. Let's take a look at our polling results, and pretty overwhelming. 53% think that it was the right move to ban Donald Trump from the internet. Very few, or a quarter, think it was the right move. And in all fairness, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey themselves were highly ambivalent about this maneuver. So at the heart of the crisis surrounding big tech is the issue of trust. Nobody understands this better than Richard Edelman, whose company has been monitoring the shifting perceptions of government, business, and society through its annual Edelman Trust Barometer. 3 years ago, that barometer pointed to issues around the battle for truth, as they called it, where people selected media that reinforced their view, the so-called echo chamber. This year, the review highlighted something called an infodemic. Richard, explain what an infodemic is and how it's led us to this current predicament that we now face.
So, Andy, the phrase that we use more broadly is we're declaring information bankruptcy. And it's on the basis that 2/3 of people in our 28 countries say that leaders are liars, that in fact, both government and business leaders intentionally deceive them. But even more profound is the low trust in media sources. So you see in this chart that every one of the four categories of media has declined substantially in the last 2 years. You'll see that mainstream media, for example, fell from 65 to about 53. Search, not quite as far. Social dragging the bottom at 35. But understand that's a global number across 28 markets. If you look in the Western countries, you're in the low 20s for trust in social media. News organizations are seen as biased. Let me give you a few specifics. 60% say journalists and reporters purposely tried to mislead us by saying things they know are false. News organizations, 60% say, are more concerned with supporting an ideology or a political position than informing the public. Third, media is not doing well at being objective. Fourth, the media is not doing well overall. 80% agree with that statement in Japan, Korea, Colombia, Argentina, Italy. Again, this used to be a problem simply of, the UK or the US or France or Germany. Not any longer. This is a transversal problem across the world because there's just a deep sense that the media has polarized into left or right camps, that it actually is chasing clicks on the basis that it makes biased statements, it therefore creates social heat, and therefore more clicks. It's the new business model of the media. So, in fact, what most shocked us in this year's study is that information from a company newsletter is more trustworthy than mainstream media and twice as trustworthy as social media. Last point, we are seeing a deep problem with information hygiene. We observe that only 25% of people actually check multiple sources. More than 50% share information in a story, even if they haven't checked the source. And so they complain about the problem, but we are the problem.
Richard, you draw a straight line between misinformation peddled by government leaders and the spread of the virus. Who were the worst offenders? Who were the models?
Well, I'm in country A for that. But, in fact, only a third of people in our global study indicated that they're prepared to be vaccinated immediately, 1/3 within a year, and 1/3 not at all. And in France, it's 50-50. And so the vaccine hesitancy is completely tied to the disinformation that's come from social media in particular. And it's been a fuzziness about the degree to which experts are to be believed, experts saying whether it's hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir or the latest, miracle solution. That's deeply undermined belief in experts and scientists who've had a drop in their own trust levels, but even more so for government leaders. Government leaders are at the lowest ebb we've seen. Now, also, just to point out, trust in tech, over the 10 years has slid by about 10 points, but even much more so in the West into the high 50s. It is still the most trusted, but it's actually demised. And we also see that social media trust is 30 points below that. So it is the new financial services. How about that?
Let me turn to Catherine Ma, the CEO of Wikipedia, which just celebrated its 20th birthday. Catherine, first, happy birthday.
Thank you.
You've been fighting misinformation and disinformation for 2 decades as an online encyclopedia. Explain a bit about how Wikipedia works and what specifically went on inside Wikipedia on January 6th as hundreds of voluntary editors assembled to figure out the facts of the storming of the Capitol. How did they reach consensus?
Sure. So Wikipedia is a little different than most social media platforms in that it's a purpose-built platform for information gathering and presentation. And part of the way that it works is that people of very different opinions and experiences have to come together to form what is essentially a single source of truth, one version of an article based on citations from the news media, other reliable sources that captures the general tone, tenor, context of an event, piece of history, individual, that sort of thing. On January 6th of this past year, of course, we saw something that is unprecedented in our lifetimes, which is the storming of the Capitol. And Wikipedia editors who focus on breaking news events worked to try to document and capture that. I think the conversation that we had in the media in ensuing days about what to call the event. Was it a riot? Was it a protest? Was it an insurrection? Sedition, all of these sorts of things was playing out in real terms on Wikipedia as editors looked to sources of information from the press. As you know well, breaking news events are very tough to cover. You're on the ground. You don't necessarily have full visibility of what's going on. Wikipedia works a little bit differently and has the advantage of being able to pull from all sorts of different sources across the press. So if you've got someone standing on the east side of the Capitol and someone standing on the west, we get to pull all of those perspectives in order to be able to describe an event in more context and greater depth, while also having all the same sort of debates about how does one present information neutrally. It was interesting to hear Richard talk a little bit about objectivity. We don't really use objectivity as a framework in Wikipedia. We use neutrality, coming from the position that you can have many different sides of a story or a perspective, but the goal is not to sort of be objective and present them all. The goal is to be neutral and present them relevant to sort of the preponderance of evidence about any particular event in a way that most people are able to accept the terms of. So it's a very different model, perhaps, than social media and even the news media.
To get back to the original question, how would you define who should be deplatformed if indeed you think that that is the right way to go? And what speech, if any, do you think should be censored?
So I think that we would start from the position that it's not so much about deplatforming, it's about enforcing terms of use and sort of conduct policies that all these platforms had. You could make the argument that that Donald Trump, certainly, but others have been some of the most egregious flouters of terms of use that offered by these platforms, and that the platforms themselves were in violation for a period of time in continuing to host these individuals on their sites. We certainly know that they're not the first politicians to be kicked off. Many politicians in other parts of the world, as Mitchell referred to, have been deplatformed without recourse. I think from our perspective, I very much wholeheartedly agree with Mitchell that regulation of an industry is not abnormal. It's quite consistent with how we handle most sectors in our economy. And there are appropriate ways to do it. I would encourage that individual platforms should be looking at their terms of use, ensuring that they have provisions that allow for broad political speech, but then draw the line at things like incitement to violence, which is very much in keeping with standards around our universal rights around freedom of expression pretty much everywhere in the world.
The plunging faith in or trust in media that Richard just outlined is a real problem for you, isn't it? I mean, you rely on vetted, verifiable sources of information to assemble your pages. How does Wikipedia exist without fact-based media outlets?
So it's interesting. I agree with you, Andy. I'll be the first to say we need trust across the entire information ecosystem. That needs to be the institutions of government. It needs to be research entities and bodies, such as our institutes of health, as well as the news media. It's incredibly important to a functioning democracy that we have a trusted news media. Interestingly, it hasn't really affected Wikipedia's trust. In fact, our trust has only grown in recent years. We can talk about why that is. I think it's because we take a different approach to how we talk about credible information with our readers and with users, and some of our incentive structures are a little bit different. But we are wholeheartedly advocates of a information ecosystem that is trusted, transparent, the transparent functioning of these media institutions, so that they are building trust with their end users, and the support for these critical public institutions that have really been sort of defunded and delegitimized by politicians over the course of the last few decades, in a way that, unfortunately, as we've seen, in a moment of great public crisis, actually can be quite harmful to our overall public functioning.
Do you have a ranking of most trusted news sources? Is there a hierarchy that you've developed? How does it work?
So Wikipedians work off this idea that of reliable or sort of verifiable sources. And the way that they approach this is obviously quite different across different topics. We have everything on Wikipedia, from medical information to breaking news events, to information about 18th century Islamic arts. So you need to be able to be very flexible in the ways that we think about credibility of sources. But we generally look at a few things, which is, does this source, is it respected in its field? Is it credible? Is it used by professionals? Does it have some sort of editorial process that ensures oversight? And that could be peer review. It could be more traditional editorial overview, such as a newspaper, for example. Does it issue corrections when it gets things wrong? Does it have a process of sort of self-auditing? And when we apply those sort of standards to almost any publication, that really allows us to be able to assess in a way that lets us change our assessment over time. There have been sources that have been essentially blacklisted from Wikipedia, but not so much a trusted ranking. I think it's really important as our knowledge ecosystem grows and changes, that we're able to be flexible and critical consumers of information, rather than sort of working off strict hierarchies or lists. The fortunes and favors of any news publication will ebb and flow over time, and so will the quality. We certainly see that even within news publications as to the topics they cover. So I think part of why Wikipedia is so trusted is we actually start from the position that our readers are smart. We trust them to be critical. We're transparent about the fact that Wikipedia itself is a work in progress. We explain where the information comes from, and by and large, that seems to work for people. It's a very different model, as I said, and I do think there's a lot to learn there.
Karen, I'd like to bring you in here. One of your concerns at the German Marshall Fund is the impact of technology on democracy. A poll conducted over the summer revealed that almost 1/3 of the American electorate would accept, quote, a strong incumbent leader who does not have to bother with Congress and elections. Is democracy threatened?
It's great question and great discussion so far. When I started working on internet policy long ago, we had this idea that the internet, by its very design, was going to enhance democracy, that it was going to give voice to the voiceless and power to the powerless. And instead, what we've seen, as you've been discussing already, is that it's been exploited and used to undermine trust and truth, which are critical inputs to democracy. And part of that is that it's grown concentrated, social media has grown up, and yet we haven't updated a lot of the offline norms and standards that we had to deal with our media environment. And so we've got this terrible growth of conspiracy theories. January 6th showed us how dangerous those can be, as have the anti-vax sentiments that have grown up, the COVID conspiracy theories, and the kinds of things you're talking about related to elections. So the problem is that the solution that we keep talking about is really this ex post whack-a-mole, where you look at the content or the abuser after the fact, after they've abused the terms of service, after they've been given chance after chance. And then we're all engaged in a debate about who should decide if it's true or not true, or offensive or not offensive. That whack-a-mole is just not working, and we need to move away from it. And I think we need to look at how to change the incentives of the platforms instead, in just the way that car companies, didn't decide to put seatbelts in cars without having their incentives changed, so that they needed to do that, but it turned out to be good for everybody. And the thing we need to look at here, I think, is the gets at some of the things that Catherine was talking about. How do we make sure that the design, not the content, how do we make sure that the design is transparent and allows folks to understand who's speaking, what the news, what the information they're getting is coming from, and what purposes it's serving?
We're going to get to that a bit later, how to change the incentive structures, as you put it. Let me ask you this, though. An associated problem, which we haven't talked about, is political disinformation of the kind that comes from authoritarian regimes. That, too, threatens democratic cohesion. What have you been seeing on that front during the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm thinking of Russia, China, Iran.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there continue to be takedowns on all the platforms of campaigns that are coming from these authoritarian regimes. It's an ongoing problem, and the same kind of lack of transparency that allows domestic conspiracy theorists to spread their disinformation also allows these authoritarian regimes to spread their disinformation. The lack of transparency in the ad tech market and the fraud there really provides a loophole into the information system. The ability of outlets like RT to spread, and bot networks, fake accounts, and so on. But what we've seen recently is this, unlike in 2016, where you could sort of isolate what Russia was doing, it's very hard to isolate the foreign state provoked disinformation campaign from domestic. And it's very hard to disentangle top-down disinformation from bottom-up. So we've really seen this intermingling of the disinformation campaigns so that it's almost like a call and response. Sometimes the foreign actors will pick up on a controversy in the US and blow it up. Sometimes they'll start something. The wildfires in Oregon is an example where it seems that some of the conspiracy theories those were being set by Antifa, that those came from abroad but were amplified here in the US.
Let me bring in a question from our audience. This one is from Greg Beyer, who's a macro ESG strategist based in the US. And he asks, should social media platforms have some liability if their users become radicalized using their technology and commit heinous acts? I'll throw that one to the panel. Anybody like to have a go at that? Karen, should social media platforms have some liability?
Yeah, I'll just say that folks are talking about this. You know, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have brought up this issue of Section 230, which is the U.S. law that limits the liability of platforms. It's in the e-commerce directive in Europe, and now there are various bills in Congress that would sort of surgically narrow Section 230 for different things, allow civil rights complaints, allow civil complaints. If you don't have transparency in your algorithms, you lose Section 230 for content that's shown to violate the law. So there are a lot of discussion around surgical narrowing of that immunity. But the thing that people don't understand, people from the left and the right who think that getting rid of the immunity is going to solve totally opposite problems, is that a liability law in the US is so weak because of our First Amendment. It's so hard to sue somebody that getting rid of it is not really going to address so many of the problems that we deal with. But there are a number of efforts to reform it.
Okay, let's shift to China for a moment. Duncan, before we get into antitrust, free speech issues, I have to ask you, as the author of the definitive book on Jack Ma, the house that Jack built, where is he? I know we've seen him on a video after he disappeared for a couple of months, but what do we know about his circumstances?
Right. Well, I mean, he built several houses personally, of course, so he could be in any number of them. The most recent public sighting that was arranged by official Zhejiang media was in Hainan at a rural education event. That was sort of, we can say, the proof of life, if you will, in terms of that he was not, quote unquote, missing, as people like the Daily Mail and others had fed during the absence of any information. Of course, this was a growing challenge. It still is. I mean, there is still a lot of cynicism about his location, but there is, I don't think, the same speculation about him being in the same kind of problems as previous missing billionaires. There has been a few, and so I think this is an attempt by the government to really focus this on regulation, anti-monopoly, and specifically in Ant, of course, the financial empire that he has built, to kind of clip the wings.
Of course, because he attacked the Chinese regulators, who struck back by halting the listing of Ant Financial, which was supposed to be the biggest IPO in the world. What on earth was he thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very unusual speech that he gave. You can look at it with subtitles, and he read it, firstly, which he rarely did. He's normally the master of improv. He's a stand-up comedian, but he always, reads the room. If he read this room, I don't know which part of the room he was reading, because in front of him were the financial regulators, past and present, and he sort of launched first into international regulation, criticizing the banking architecture of Basel and so on, and then he kind of went straight into China without really putting a firewall there that tempered his criticisms. I mean, so and he sort of talked as though it was a fait accompli that the IPO was going to happen. It had already priced, it was going to be the largest in the world, etc. But price doesn't mean trading. And so it seems like there was a game there to sort of forestall some regulation that he knew was coming. Maybe he was put up to it, or he did it himself. We don't know. But it was a very out of character speech for him, and a very expensive one.
One of the things I find very interesting is that Beijing's pulling of the Ant IPO and the subsequent antitrust investigation into Alibaba has found quite a bit of support among the general public. Contrary to popular belief, Jack Ma isn't adored by everybody in China as the champion of the little guy, the ant. What happened? What's happened to the public perception of Jack Ma in China?
Well, the first point to make is that, unlike with Edelman survey, it's very difficult to know exactly what the public thinks here. But it's true to say that perhaps over the last few years, there's been a number of issues that have dented a little bit his image. I mean, for example, the 996 debate, which is about the 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week that employees of some of these tech companies work. And Jack sort of at one point weighed in and saying, well, that's how it's going to be. And, we've seen that affecting a number of tech companies, including just last week, Pinduoduo. So actually, some of it has been over the work, culture. Some of it has been over the sheer wealth. But overall, I mean, I think we heard earlier about, trust in tech. People in China associate a lot of the benefits in certainly in urban and in urbanizing China of the past decade and 15 years a lot with technology, because e-commerce, there were crummy shops selling expensive things, and now the convenience is so great just in the e-commerce area, and that has spread a bit to information. Now there's been pushback and control from the government for sure, but generally I think you have a generally more pro-tech population in terms of trying things, embracing things. So it hasn't been as necessarily about big tech, because actually consumers have had generally a good deal. There's been actually subsidy wars from different companies like Meituan and Alibaba and others. So I don't think it's so much about their experience as consumers. It may be envy, it may be resentment of some things he said, and people tiring of it, maybe that he was such a hero. I mean, he was almost worshipped actually 5-6 years ago. So it's definitely been a bit tarnished. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's talk about free speech. We've heard from Richard about the infodemic. How's that playing out in China? Does the Chinese public trust the information that they're getting from state media on the pandemic?
Well, I was here for SARS, and that actually was the growth of text messaging and broadband subscriptions in response to a desire for more information from other sources. which has been clamped down over, in various cycles. We're still emerging. I mean, China has pretty much emerged in many, many ways from the worst of the pandemic. I mean, it was not a very prolonged experience. We know a year ago it was a very different conversation. And, the New York Times, Li Yuan had a piece just yesterday about this, that a year ago, you would have never have predicted the sense that there is trust, more trust, because of the way the epidemic has been handled, or the pandemic, I should say. So, the public health response on its own, strict, which was very criticized at the time, has engendered a sense of, well, maybe they know what they're talking about. At the same time, let's be realistic. I mean, there's no independent surveys to understand how people really think. And we all know one of the delicious, wonderful things about living in China is the amount of cynicism that is expressed one-on-one. That definitely has been constrained because some of that was previously on Weibo, and we've definitely seen people, kind of wiping a lot of the comments on social media. So you definitely feel that social media is much less vibrant, but the healthy lack of trust and cynicism in a way towards stuff that, they don't believe is still there. But how does it express itself?
I got to ask you about wolf warrior diplomacy, the use of Twitter by Chinese diplomats throughout this pandemic, channeling their outrage against the West. It seems to have backfired. It has backfired terribly. Why do they persist?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You think about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In the U.S., the State Department is, a very senior department, right? And the secretary is very senior in government. That's not the case in China. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is pretty low down the pecking order. You don't have a representative in the, the standing committee or the I think the Politburo in the, at the highest levels, because, it's dealing with foreigners, it's barbarian management, right, traditionally. So I think there has been this bizarre sense of trying to compete for favor. And it's been unfortunate because, otherwise, qualified diplomats have also signed up to this. So, we'll see. I mean, there's clearly some discomfort within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about that on an individual basis, but there's no way diplomats can push back. So it's a very unfortunate development of the last year or so.
Karen, let me ask you that the Chinese Communist Party realized very early that social media was a potent threat. Hence the Great Firewall, hence the most sophisticated censorship regime in the world. But the Communist Party has also quite cleverly figured out ways to co-opt social media. It's not all about censorship. It's also about steering the national conversation, sort of somebody put it, twiddling dials, twiddling knobs on a control panel. Do you think this is going to be a model that will eventually replace the free and open internet?
That is going to be a major challenge, I believe, for the administration. So we've been talking about the disinformation disorder, but this issue of this battle for the information space, this contest for the information space vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes, and especially China and Russia, is really profound. And as you said, it's censorship, it's propaganda, and it's also surveillance. That the ability to gather all this data, and in China that includes payment data, and gather it with very few safeguards and guardrails, using facial recognition technology, using other technologies that can identify you by your gait. And China's also been selling a lot of this technology to authoritarians and would-be authoritarians around the world, often with the Belt and Road Initiative. So there really is a contest, I think, for what is the future of the internet going to be like, and is it going to allow this kind of surveillance, censorship, and propaganda? And the U.S. is going to have to, I think, work very closely with allies, with democratic allies, to figure out what kinds of framework they endorse, and then to really promote it around the world. And China's already engaged in that kind of diplomacy, in part through the countries that it's been selling this technology to, through the UN, through standard setting organizations. And the US is quite late to the party.
Catherine, it seems the CCP finds facts threatening. You've been blocked there since April 2019, according to Wikipedia. Do you see any prospect of getting unblocked?
Time will tell. I think that we take a very sort of long horizon view on information. We were blocked in Turkey for 2.5 years, and we are now unblocked. I don't know, Andy, is the question. Wikipedia has been accessible in China and inaccessible in China, and plenty of people access Wikipedia from within China using VPNs and other sort of proxy applications. What is great about Wikipedia is that people do edit it from all over the world in Chinese. We've got folks in Hong Kong and Taiwan and in the broader diaspora, and so our sort of approach on this one is it's going to be there for folks who are able to access it, whether that's now through these other means or hopefully at some point in the future. But we don't have any direct line of communication with the decision makers in China, and have never been given a clear explanation for what the problem is from their perspective.
Is blocking a trend around the world? Where else are you blocked?
We're not blocked anywhere else that we are aware of at the moment, but absolutely, this is one of the biggest concerns that we have as we look to the global landscape. Is this fragmentation of the web that Karen was just describing is the game. We're well underway, is how I would put it. The conversations we were having about a free and open internet under the previous administration are really sort of OBE, or overtaken by events, as they would say. These sort of efforts to block and or manipulate and or force social media entities to remove information in order to continue operations are very common tactics across the globe. And unfortunately, one of the biggest concerns that we're seeing is that this is increasingly a tactic in democratic nations as well. I think all eyes are on India at the moment in terms of what we're seeing pressure there to remove information across different social platforms, take down requests and the like under the current government. And this is the world's largest democracy we're talking about. So we are concerned that these are the sort of trends that we're seeing as spaces close for open expression and inquiry, even in countries that we've long thought sort of were representative of the sort of open societies that most people prefer to live in.
Right. We've only got a few minutes left, and we're going to use the time to work together, this panel, like, dare I say it, the Wikipedia editing team, to try to reach some kind of a consensus on the way forward. First of all, Richard, what is the role, can I ask you, of business in helping to clean up this mess? One of the interesting findings from your recent survey is that actually business is now one of the most trusted institutions in the world.
So actually, business is the most trusted institution, and my employer is even more trusted than that. So my employer is 15 points higher than business in general. My CEO, 15 points higher than normal CEOs. It seems to me that on a spectrum, Andy, we could say, okay, you're a brand. Stop advertising on platforms that don't meet certain standards. That's one option. That happened over the summer, as you'll recall, with Unilever and Facebook. Further along the line, you could say, okay, I'm a company. I have a responsibility to educate my employees. And so I'm going to use my own channels as a means to help them get certain facts so that they can share in social. Further, you could say, look, it's a responsibility of a company to try to educate its broader community. And for example, Chevron actually has a newspaper in its local market in California, which it operates. Now that's on the furthest end. So in my view, business has an opportunity and a responsibility to help fill the void left by a shrinking media sector. And I mean shrinking in terms of economics, not just in trust.
This implies a greatly expanded role for business. Do you see companies increasingly weighing in on political, social issues like racism, inequality, even free speech?
Absolutely. We saw it over the summer in the US on issues of systemic racism. And the result of this is substantial increases in trust for brands and companies that stick their heads up and say, what happened in the murder of George Brown is not acceptable, George Floyd is not acceptable in our society. That we've got to do better. We have an ability as a society to make sure that these populations are treated fairly. And Business has to be part of that solution. But also business has to stop just telling one side of the story if it's going to participate, say the bad and the good about every story.
Isn't taking sides isn't that also a business risk?
I think the greater risk is lack of information in a paralyzed society. Again, look at vaccination. It's a job to be done here to persuade employees, as opposed to smashing your fist down and saying you will get vaccinated or you won't work at such a company. It's necessary to bring people along. And there's such a lot of disinformation that it has to be countered, partly by business.
Question from the audience. This one from Tamara Singh, who is the founder of Who, What, Where, based in Singapore. She asks, who is best placed to set global standards and supervise big tech? I might add, what should those standards be? Who'd like to have a go at that? Who is best placed to set global standards? Well, maybe we could start with Wikipedia. Catherine, what should the standards be? How do you go about setting standards?
Well, I think this is really difficult. I mean, there are standards for the responsibilities of business, for example, in upholding human rights and enabling freedom of expression. These are business principles that are adopted at the international levels, referred to as the Ruggie principles. But look, at the end of the day, the challenge here is actually that government is responsible for protecting its citizens. That's one of the things that I think Mitchell spoke to earlier, especially in the case of democratically elected governments. And one of the things that large tech companies tend to sort of take advantage of is the fact that they are cross-jurisdictional and have operations in different countries, and move those operations and policy setting accordingly in their favor. And they're very well positioned with lobbyists to be very influential in terms of the creation and setting up those standards. I think Mitchell made this point that it's very hard for consumers to be able to sort of understand the way the technology works in their best interest. And this is where we would really call for greater accountability. I think that there are some interesting areas that around sort of market expectations for transparency, institutional investor funds, for example. We'd like to see some more downward pressure on what technology companies are doing and how they are held to account. We're talking some of the most highly valued platforms on the planet, or companies on the planet. But at the end of the day, this is a really tricky question. Otherwise, we would have a better answer at this point. Some form of co-regulation or regulation coming out of Brussels and out of Washington would be greatly helpful. Setting those standards well, coming out of countries that are more democratic, helps create models for around the globe. Working through international institutions to understand what those interoperability standards are through sort of the appropriate international bodies that are used to govern the internet as a whole, and the investment and the interest and engagement of the capital markets in terms of thinking about what ethical investing looks like is also a lever for pressure.
Duncan, what about breaking up big tech? That seems to be the direction that the Chinese government, Chinese regulators are heading in now, at least in certain areas of technology.
Well, the CCP obviously didn't get the memo that, big tech is bigger than them, right? And I had to laugh when the Onion, I think last summer, put out a piece saying that, Facebook has decided to break up the US government because it thinks it's become too powerful. I mean, that's the kind of thing that played very well in China. Oddly, we had this bizarre situation of Trump threatening to take down TikTok. And actually, it was TikTok that first took down Donald Trump recently. But anyway, so this is very well understood by technocratic regimes. And we can talk about, democratic and non-democratic technocratic regimes. But basically, governments understanding the technology. TikTok has 100 million users in the US based on algorithms developed, here in China. And so I think it's a game of if you neglect this, if governments neglect understanding the technology and outsourcing that to companies, you're going to get results which they may not like. And so in China, there hasn't been, of course, a naivete about the power of technology. We're talking about a Leninist government that understands the power of the printing presses. The printing presses are now algorithmic, and they know that. And so they're looking to shape. They have other objectives, the economy, projecting soft power and others. So they're trying to use the tool more than just break them.
Question for Richard. This one from Alexander Wegner, who's an account director at APCO Worldwide in Saudi Arabia. He says, asks, reflecting on the past 4 years under the Trump administration and the administration's use of spokespeople, what role should the communications industry play in the ongoing, increasingly partisan struggle over truth? Your own industry, Richard.
We have a lot to do with the problem. And we have to insist that CEOs speak up. And when they do, to be straightforward and to be insisting that there be policy change. I think our biggest problem is there was communication without action. And to me, no communication works without substance. And we had a lot of show and not a lot of do. And the two need to come together.
We're running out of time rapidly. One last question. Article 19, which is a free speech lobby group, has suggested that platforms should outsource their moderation decisions to non-governmental social media councils, something like the press watchdogs that in many countries hold newspapers to a voluntary code. Karen, do you think this is the right approach?
It's interesting to talk about a code. After World War II, the news media came together in the US, and there were separate efforts in Europe to say, how do we ensure that we don't become just instruments of propaganda? And they adopted and codified a bunch of processes that ensured transparency and credibility. So, when you pick up your newspaper at the newsstand, or when you used to, you would see a masthead. You can see a byline on the articles. There are codes and standards. They issue corrections. This kind of transparency and ability to understand where the information is coming from is incredibly important to the user, but it's also incredibly important to watchdogs. And I think that's what they're talking about. And we need to see the platforms go from the sort of deceptive design that they've grown up with, which allows outlets to pretend to be news outlets when they're really just, content mills or partisan sheets. When bots are pretending to be human, they need to have instead of that kind of deceptive design that allows that kind of activity, they need to have pro-democratic design that has much more transparency, not only for the user, but as is mentioned for watchdogs to help users understand what's going on. And that kind of transparency is central to the original values of the internet. It should be embraced. It's unfortunate that we've gone away from that kind of transparency. And I think democratic nations shouldn't see any kind of trade-off between transparency, free expression, and other democratic values.
One final question just came in from Anita Berninger, the director of product marketing at The Shift Network in the United States. Anita asked, how can you protect the First Amendment during this process of determining how to curb disinformation? How do you curb disinformation being spread by media outlets? Who'd like to have a final go at that one? Disinformation. How do you prevent media outlets from spreading it? Catherine.
I was wondering if you were going to call on me, Andy. I think it's important to recognize that the protection of the First Amendment is the government is protecting citizens against the application of censorship by the government. It is not the determination by a private entity to not host someone on their site or have someone on their morning shows or the like. I really think that these conversations, I think the point that Karen made around sort of standards and transparency are tremendously important. We have had already conversations around sort of regulatory authorities. I think that, again, the media, I'm really grateful she brought up this question of media watchdogs and sort of the civil society sector that enables some of these accountabilities. And again, I'm just going to also come back to there is an investor responsibility here. We're talking to Bloomberg New Economy. These are platforms platforms that are the most highly capitalized, most highly valued in our markets, and there's a responsibility for investors to say, what are the standards and expectations we have around sort of ethical comportment of these companies, in the same way that we hold the extractive industries or the financial sector to have some degree of regulation, disclosure, and reporting. So that's, I think, where I would leave it.
Richard, final word to you. What is the single most important thing that media should do to restore trust?
Get back to reporting from just following tweets, and also make sure that it's fact as opposed to opinion, and try and bring the two sides back together. To pursue business models based on going to the edges is deeply destructive to democracy.
Thanks, Richard. That sounds good to me. Just the facts. Thanks to all of you who have shared thoughts and questions in the Q&A box. We'll get. I'm so sorry. We're gonna have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Duncan Clark, Richard Edelman, Karen Kornblue, and Catherine Ma. Thank you again for joining us today. We're grateful for your participation and your perspective. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Mozilla's Mitchell Baker for taking the time to join our conversation, and to our audience, both within and beyond the Bloomberg New Economy community. Thank you for joining us. You can follow the conversation with @NewEconForum on Twitter, or like us on Facebook. And don't miss coverage of what to expect in 2021. Bloomberg's The Year Ahead virtual event is live this afternoon from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, with interviews with the CEOs of Hyatt and Carnival Corporation. Visit bloomberglive.com for more details. Thank you, and stay well.